My name is Rob Hamblen, and I am I guess you could say, a strategic or creative designer. And I am a founder of my own company called Be the Leap, and I'm based in Berlin.
Nice.
So what is it that Be the Leap does? Let's start there. What exactly does Be the Leap and what service is it providing?
Good question. So if you think of a business, and then if you're also familiar with human-centered design, imagine Be the Leap being positioned exactly in the middle. So we help businesses succeed through making better products that are more human-centered. And then obviously we help make human-centered products and services more appealing, obviously through what the business is trying to achieve as well.
And by human-centered, you mean like things that are easily consumable and understandable and inherently make sense to their target audience?
Basically, we're designing for humans at the end of the day. So a lot of companies end up designing products where they don't actually speak to their customers, and it's a bit of a travesty. So we try and bridge that gap, and we try and make it feel like there's a bit more of a connection with their business and obviously the people that they're ultimately creating digital experiences for.
Nice. So today's episode, we wanted to dive into this concept of sprints, and maybe you could just give us a bit of an intro into that topic, like what a sprint is, how it started life as a design sprint, and why it's become so important with product development in mind.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot of questions there, a lot of answers. So I guess let's take a step back. My first exposure with running design sprints was at a small agency based in Berlin called AJ & Smart. And I had actually just left IBM as a creative director of UX to join this very small agency. And they had actually remodeled their agency to only run design sprints. And this is going back to like 2016. And there was a book launched by a guy called Jake Knapp. And it was basically a 5-day, like test a product vision in 5 days and know whether you're basically going to, have a viable business at the end of it. Jake is ex Google Ventures, and he had kind of mastered this kind of process whilst he was at Google Ventures. And that's kind of, I guess it gave its validation. It's almost like a gladiator style, like thumbs up, thumbs down at the end of those 5 days. And it was a very condensed, very kind of high pressure, I kind of guess you could say environment or week, where all of the key stakeholders that need to make a decision on the future of their business or their product basically all come together and make decisions in a much expedited fashion. But for me, I guess you could say the design sprint is actually a way to kind of fast forward time into the future. And we only really use design sprints with companies who either startups or big Fortune 500s who can't really answer a question in order to know where to get started. So if you think of it almost like time travel, you create a mock-up, you test it with 5 users, you analyze that data, and then you have an understanding of like, well, how is it going to perform with these people that you're intending it for? But also you've got all the key people in that room who have made decisions about whether they should be spending money in making that product or not. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more around this discussion. I'm sure we're going to go a little bit more into it in a minute. But if you think of it ultimately as a way of getting the stakeholder team aligned and putting them in touch with their customers so that they can really understand how that product vision is likely to perform. And you do that in days rather than months. Like that's probably the easiest way of explaining it.
Okay. What kind of problems is it best suited to solve? Is it like, hey, our website isn't getting a lot of traffic, or
yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, you ultimately can run a design sprint for anything. We do not, because they're typically pretty expensive packages. But really, okay, so the best way to think about this is if you've got an existing product and you need to add something like a feature or function that's maybe going to be a payment or a subscription model, or you're adding something completely new and contrasting to that already very beautiful experience, you would run a design sprint for that, because you don't really want to undo all the work that you've already done in kind of creating this really great app, and now you're expecting people to pay for it. So when it's highly disruptive to the end user, that is likely when you would run a design sprint. Or if you're a huge company and you have a hunch on a vision of where your product is moving, you would maybe, before you invest tons of money, like hiring teams of developers and product managers, basically people to run that piece of the work, you would run a design sprint to work out first whether it's valid, whether it's actually going to be, everything that you want it to be.
And from a kind of junior point of view, somebody who maybe isn't like a stakeholder or CEO or that kind of level, do you think it's still quite a useful mentality? Do you think it's useful for someone who's starting out in tech who might be unfamiliar with some of the things that you're saying? Do you think it's still a valuable tool to learn and skill?
I think there's enough information on the internet now that you can research a design sprint to know exactly like what the intent is of why you would run one. If you're junior, if you're new to this podcast, if you're new to your first gig, for example, you're not going to be expected to run one, but you're certainly going to be expected to kind of know what a design sprint is and the outcomes that you're likely to get from it. So that being said, everybody has to run their first design sprint at some point. It helps if you do have some product knowledge. You do not have to be a creative designer to make the prototype. And actually, we proved this in one of our sprints. We made the prototype completely in Keynote. And it's just a way to kind of build a smoke and mirrors illusion with the team of people that you're likely to be kind of working with that are going to be accountable for this. And if you're new, then it's likely that the only people that will make those decisions, certainly in a Fortune 500, the C-suite and leadership team. But if you're a startup, however, then you basically get the founding team, and you can certainly create an illusion of this product to kind of work out whether it's likely to be all that you intend it to be.
How long are sprints generally? Are they varying?
So they do vary. So the Jake sprint, or the Google sprint, if you want, is 5 days. And you would have a maximum of probably between 8 and 10, maybe 12 people in that room. And that would range from typically like the most senior people responsible for that app. And then you would also have like the product team. So in our instance, you would have like 3, sometimes 4 of us in there as well. So 12 is the max. And it's deliberately designed to be small to keep it agile, and not agile in the way that you're learning, as in nimble and fast. And but that 5-day sprint with Jake, you would have that whole team in that room for the whole 5 days. So when I was at AJ and Smart, we actually streamlined that 5-day sprint to be 4 days. And I know that there's a lot of nodding heads now with you two. It's like, I know that like you're thinking, wow, 5 days, 4 days, like, what's the big difference? But actually we made a conscious decision that, we were looking at enterprise clients, and it was a big ask to have them kind of step away from the business, the operational side of their business for 5 days.
So that was what I was going to say. Getting an entire team in a room for a week feels like, it better be a pretty good decision we make by the end of it to give up 5 days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so, we made it a 4-day sprint so that we could only get the leadership team or the stakeholder team in for 2 days. And then we would do literally everything else asynchronously on the Wednesday and Thursday. So if you imagine you have the workshop format, which is split into 4 quadrants, I'll go into these in a little bit. You at the end of those 2 days, you would have almost like a sketched out blueprint of like the thing that you were going to test. It's almost like, okay, we're to throw a ton of money at this. Like, what's the gamble that we want to get the answers from? Then on the Wednesday, you would prototype it. You would only spend 8 hours mocking this product experience up. And then you would put it in front of 5 user testers that would have been pre-selected based on, the fitting the requirements for the people that are going to be ultimately your customers. And then on the Friday, we would just gather the data. But here's the difference. So what's called an iteration sprint. So when we get that data on the Friday, we are kind of pretty confident in our findings and guiding those teams as well. That we say, we're going to help you put our money where our mouth is. And we will act on that data. We will iterate on the prototype. We will test again with another 5 users. And then we actually hone in with way more accuracy on the likelihood of those features or functions that we're going to test. There's a really lovely metaphor for describing the sprint, okay? And for those of you that know the game of darts, it's like you're trying to hit a bullseye. At the very beginning, you're trying to hit a bullseye in a completely dark room. So you have assumptions on where the actual dartboard is, and you might have an assumption that the bullseye is going to be in that direction. But to really land the dart in that bullseye is a huge ask. It's unlikely that you'll ever do it, okay? You might get really lucky and do it. So if you think of the design sprint as a way of turning that light on, so when you've tested with those first 5 users, it's almost like you turn the light on in that room and you see where your dart has landed. And it could be that you were close. Maybe you hit the actual dartboard. Maybe you came close to the bullseye, but you weren't quite spot on. But what that means is that the light coming on is almost like you being able to see exactly like, the actions that you've taken. So if you think of the iteration week, we're going to have another go at the bullseye with the light on and seeing where our dart has landed. It gives you that way more accuracy, that way more a better understanding of like the data that you've gathered on the previous week. You've already met some of those customers that you are likely to speak to some of them again, maybe. But it just means that you're likely to shed a whole lot more light on the situation and clarity to move forward, basically.
No excuse to miss the second time then.
Yeah, right, exactly. No pressure.
That's how I play darts, yeah. Second time, every time. I think if you're... it's interesting listening to you talk about it, because I think that it shows you that if you're a junior or like you are just starting in this world, then kind of gives you an idea of how fast decisions can be made and how it is sometimes important to... It's obviously important to validate, but there is an element of just experience and kind of going for it. And I guess it's kind of like a gut feeling as well in those 5 days of things that are working and things that aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And it's like, it isn't a silver bullet for everything, though, I have to say. Like, and I've run hundreds of sprints for, companies like Adidas, Twitter, HSBC, like you name it. Like we've run sprints for pretty much every industry. And it's like sometimes you do a sprint for a startup and they're like, okay, I'm going to have like the final app in the like space of this like 2 weeks. It's like, no, you're not. Actually, we're good, but we're not that good. It's kind of like, but what it does is it's exactly what you just said. It expedites decisions that would normally be very, very hard to make. So when you've got the key people that are going to be accountable for that product in the same room, and they're all exposed to the same information and they're all exposed to one person making these decisions, you get alignment. Okay. And I've seen it. I've worked at IBM. Like it sometimes takes you months to get alignment on decisions to be, made to move forward. And like you've got this client, you've got the steering committee, you've got like designed by everybody. It's like, decisions are very hard to make. When you've got the pressure cooker environment of a sprint, you're almost throwing everything out to just go, look, okay, we've got these hunches, we've got these assumptions. If we just say that we're going to commit to this for the sake of this week and we see what comes out the other side, it just means that you will have ultimately saved probably months of time, and you've kind of pressure cooked those decisions to just give you a result at the end. And that's what it means. It's like, it's not going to be 100% right. But if you've got a question about whether you should change your app so much, like it's such a risk. Do we make these decisions? Do we just go with a funk spec and build something? Do we build a new feature based on like the stakeholders kind of like hunch that that's what they want? It's a huge gamble. Like and there's a lot to lose. So why wouldn't you want to find out a little bit of an insight into kind of like whether it's going to work or not? But in days,
it's that Jeff Bezos's mentality, isn't it? It's if you've got 70% of the information, just make a decision. It doesn't have to be. You need 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can like perfect and tweak it afterwards. And it's like, if you think of like, I mean, when I've run sprints for like American Express, we actually ran the sprint pre-research. So like the research team would commission us. We would come in and basically kind of prove a few hypotheses that they wanted to prove. And then they would then go and do research. And there was a big misconception for a long time about, well, design sprint's great. Like we don't now have to do this. We've got all the answers. We can now just go straight into execution. It can be used at literally every end of the double diamond, like, because it can be proved to kind of like, prove something that you have an idea on and kind of work upwards. Or if you want to hone in on something, then you can also run a design sprint there. But it's just not used for everything. You have to use it very respectfully.
How does someone contribute then if they're like on the junior end of the team? If they're such big decisions over such a short time, how do people get there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you are a junior and you are in a sprint, like that's an amazing environment to be in. So congratulate yourself, give yourself a pat on the back, because it's normally that you've done something normally pretty good to kind of be one of the few. And it's how do you contribute? So typically, maybe I can explain it in how Be the Leap, how we train our kind of sprint team, or if we have like guest designers in it, for example, and they're called designers, but they ultimately are responsible for a lot of the other operational kind of parts of a sprint as well. It's almost like the hot seat. So it's very unlikely that they would facilitate anything. They would, because the sprints are kind of, they're orchestrated to kind of be almost a bit like a performance, certainly when we run sprints. But it's not to say that you can't give exposure to kind of, to new or young people to coming into this kind of environment. But it just means that like there's a lot of pressure on us to perform. So we're not going to kind of put you under the pressure and get you to, for example, run like the first quarter, which is incredibly stressful. But what we will do is we will guide, and we will expose you to those conversations that would normally be kind of behind kind of closed kind of boardroom doors. And I think that's, if you're in this sprint for your first time, that's the biggest takeaway I would say, is you get to really hear how kind of founding teams and leadership teams actually make decisions, and you hear the conversations. And it's something I've always said to like my team, is like you literally get elevated very quickly into a completely different way of thinking, because you're then honing in onto kind of why decisions for the business are being made, rather than just like, oh, can we make that call to action, a little bit brighter so we can see it? And then the designer goes, all right, I've run a few tests based on your branding guidelines, and we've now got a couple of like really cool buttons. Whereas if you're in a leadership stakeholder meeting and they're saying that like, we're just getting too many people churning from our website, we're losing customers, and we can't work out why our competitors are taking our market share, then what it's likely to be is something like, well, maybe the checkout process is below the fold, or like you have to scroll for it, or there's a long sign up kind of onboarding section, for example. So all of these things, these UX things, could be very simply resolved, but you're kind of hearing business decisions around why things should be fixed or why things should be changed. But I want to be explicitly clear, you wouldn't ever run a design sprint just for like a UX thing. There's normally something to do with the business model, something to do with metrics and KPIs not performing, and that's why a new feature or a new something or a new product is likely to be conceived out of that design sprint to make the business perform better.
Nice. So there's definitely a lot of benefits. It seems like a lot of easy. Well, you're making it sound like a lot of easy wins, just like chat for 5 days and it'll work. But if maybe you could just go into sort of like mistakes, because I think it sounds to me like you could apply this mentality to a lot of different parts of if you're on a junior team or you're on a dev team and stuff. When I first read that sprint book, it definitely gave me the impression that I could just apply this to anything. Like you could apply it to, like a dev process, or you could apply it to like the way that you review PRs or something like that. But then actually when you drill into it, it's a bit of a bad fit for that. So I don't know if there are sort of common mistakes that people make during that decision-making process, whether it's an applicable kind of like process to go through, and basically how you can prevent that bad application.
Yeah, I think the challenge just has to be worthy of like, the team stepping away from their core, like running of their business. So you're expecting them to invest their time for the future outcomes of the business. So I would say that's the first one. Just make sure that the challenge is gritty enough for it, and not for just changing like some UX or color of button in like a website, for example. Other mistakes I've seen are, so in a sprint, you normally have the most senior, most responsible person who is what we call the decider. And, sometimes when we've run sprints for kind of startups and there's 2 founding, team members, and, I think even Jake allows you to have 2 deciders. But in all of our sprints we've only ever allowed 1. And that's because we only need one of you to make a decision at that point in time. You can still confer and talk with your team, but ultimately, where we see time being wasted is if people are, I think it should be this, I think it should be that. You just go around in circles. Whereas if you then put a timer on it, because everything is time boxed in a sprint, this is where the pressure comes from. If you feel like they're just butting heads, or you're going down like rabbit holes, you can just give an extra 2 minutes and go, right, at the end of 2 minutes, like one of you is making a decision, and it's normally the decider. So have a decider that's really strong, but not overpowering. Have a decider that's going to be the one that's ultimately going to sign this thing off. But also, like, one of the key things about running a sprint is you need to know if it's not going to work at the end of the week. Remember when I said like gladiator thumbs up or thumbs down? We actually go into a lot of our sprints with our clients going, we are going to basically try and prove that this product is not going to work. We're going to come up with all the hypotheses that are going to break it. We do not have a problem saying at the end of the week whether you should or shouldn't put money into this thing. And I think a lot of companies or a lot of teams go into sprints thinking, wow, this is going to be great. We're going to have some execution work afterwards. We're going to be doing this. That's not how we work. We are basically trying to prove that product's going to fail. So we are pretty hard candidates to kind of like understand if there's a little bit of sway or a little bit of something that's positive, then of course we'll dig into that. But we'll always remind the client that there's a risk of doing something.
Yeah.
So the other thing is basically you hear other companies or people going, oh, I've done a 3-day sprint or I've done a 2-day sprint. And then or it's like you ask the team, it's like, have you done a sprint before? And they go, yeah, I've done a sprint. I've done like 5. And it's like, okay, tell me how that went. It's like, well, it wasn't really a sprint. We just did the workshop part and then we never user tested it. And it's like, oh my God, it's like you haven't done a sprint then. So be careful of bastardizing a very robust process. And what we've often found is that if you ever meet anybody where typically the sprint has not worked, there's been either someone not strong enough to make a decision about whether the product should be made or not, or they've bastardized the process and they've not really run a sprint. So, and I think that's sometimes where it gets a little bit of a bad, rapport sometimes, because people think they can interchange all of these parts and then somehow say that they've run a sprint. But ultimately, if you run the workshop, you have to use a test and you have to mock it up. And that's the only way a sprint is getting this kind of condensed kind of understanding of data.
Yeah. And I guess actually just to go back a step there, that's a really good lesson for people who are joining tech teams. Just saying yes all the time definitely isn't the right answer. If someone's like, we want to build this thing, it's great. Like validating that and actually saying no when it's not a good decision is so important, because it's so easy to sort of see something sort of new and shiny and just be like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. It's going to be great. And then you kind of like throw full effort into it. But yeah, just to sort of even take a step back and consider whether it's a good idea or not. I think that's a really good lesson, because I think as a junior, you get very excited and you're just like, yeah, I'm going to do this and going to get involved any way I can. But sort of saying no is also very.
What I've noticed is the answer is always, okay, you run user testing, find out what people do and don't like, right? But most of the time, you don't have users when you're building things. At least in my experience of working in startups and building things, it's like a lot of the time you're either pre-launch, you're building a platform to be launched, or it's been launched, or you don't have a massive user base. Obviously, I'm excluding working for like established thing. So then this decision of like, okay, let's build this. It's really hard to say no because you don't have the data to say, well, people won't like this. So it's kind of all assumption work in that sense. I think I came to that just because you were saying there, Tim, like, yeah, don't like say yes to everything. And I find lately I have a hard time convincing people not to build things because we haven't got a massive user base for me to say, well, this is the way our users are working. So I have to say a lot of, this is the way I want them to work, and that doesn't fit into it. And that's not necessarily a strong argument from my stance.
We've seen that as well, like where you have either like, startup teams where the founders are clearly building a product for themselves, and like they might be such an edge case themselves they haven't really done the research on like who are likely to be their customers. Or they've just made the assumption that like, yeah, like every, 23 to 29-year-old who drinks coffee is going to love my products. It's like, yeah, okay, right. That's quite an assumption, but yeah. I think it's like, I'm just throwing like misinformation out there just to prove a point, but it's, there is a lot of work to be done. And I think also the sprint really does help you really understand who your target users are as well. So it's a great way to actually get you to step out of your kind of like, it's all about me and my products, but also thinking about, well, actually, if we are going to create this product and we want some investment, then actually the sprint is a great way to prove that there is an audience there for it as well. And we've run sprints specifically for that. The output of the sprint would be obviously some sort of digital product, but also it'd be like, we need to create a pitch deck because we want to put something in front of investors. And it's a great way to give you that kind of prototype, that early kind of vision of what this kind of product is likely to kind of have and how it's going to communicate to its customers. And then obviously you get the information that you can also back it up with actually, yeah, we tested with 5 users. If you did the iteration sprint, we tested with like 9 users and 1 repeat, for example, just to prove that actually this is kind of moving in the direction that you think it's gonna move. So that always blows my mind. And actually, I have to say, the sprints that I've ran, none of them have ever failed. And there've been a few sticky moments where, when I was learning in the early days, like how to run one, be like, wow, like we've got we haven't planned this one. And, maybe you had 2 founders that were arguing and they wanted to go different ways with the business. Like, that's also happened in one of my sprints. So pulling it back, what I've actually found is that, as much as I am a designer and a strategist, I'm also almost like a product counselor for this team as well, because they also just want to hear, how it compares to like other products, and is it likely to have this much traction? Are we 3x? Are we 10x? What is this? Like, all of these things, they kind of look for these answers. And I would just say that, that's typically why we're hired for product teams, because it's less actually about the process and it being, we de-risk it because we've run like hundreds of sprints all over the world for different companies. So it's less about the process. It's actually about giving them the outcome. And that's what kind of gives me a little like do you know what? This is actually a really cool thing. Yeah. And then obviously once you've got the team and you've got them aligned, that's another thing as well. Like, Monday lunchtime, we're 3 hours in. I've had huge Fortune 500 companies. We'd be sat around a table at lunchtime, and one of the team has gone like, how are we this aligned in 3 hours? It would take us 3 months for us to be where we are right now on our normal day-to-day workings. Like, what have you actually done in the room where we're now suddenly going, right, well, this is the vision, and you're either supporting it or you're kind of hating it. But there's a lot of work that we do in preparation before everybody gets into that workshop. We're trying to understand who all the players are, where the dynamics are, where the politics are, you name it. We're literally deconstructing everything so that when everybody comes into that room, we know who everybody is. We also know how the likelihood of how some conversations are going to go. We also know if there's going to be maybe someone who doesn't agree and maybe who does want to disrupt the process a little bit. But what we've often found is that those people are quite interesting because they have such a strong perspective in the direction of something. They're normally people that have been, in the company for a long time, and they might have new leadership coming in and they're kind of saying a product should go a certain way. And it's like, in most cases, it's just giving the stage for, obviously for us, whoever commissions the sprint, to be able to go, okay, well, this is the vision we're going. Some of these other people might not have been privy to conversations around, is the company going to be acquired? Is there another investor coming in? All of these things sway the direction of where a product can move. And I think once you've then got the team in play and they're privy to all of these kind of pieces of information, then there's a lot more clarity on why certain decisions are being made. And that's why the sprint works, because you're able to kind of expedite the outcome of that to know whether it's going to be the right thing or not.
Is there any examples, or can you share any examples of like complete successes that have come from a sprint and led to some phenomenal product launch or something that's completely turned around the fortune of a company?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say names, but I can certainly give a clue in the industry. There was, we'd ran sprint for a global bank, let's just say. Okay. And they had identified that a lot, especially with the new kind of crypto platforms that were coming up, these neobanks, they were pulling a lot of their younger investors away from the platform. So again, this is like when you hear people going, oh yeah, we've got data, we're reviewing it. This was kind of like one of the first projects where actually that was tangible. They were tracking a lot of their customers. They had all of their age demographics. They got them all kind of like understood. And they just saw a decline in how much they were actually investing in their own products. And they could see, like, if you're, transferring money to I'm trying to think of a platform now, but yeah, if you can see them transferring like a big chunk of their monthly salary to like Trade Republic, for example, that's one I was trying to think of a minute ago, they're going to be like, well, okay, that's like a big chunk. And if I can see this pattern happening over 12 months, that's like a big chunk. And if 15% of our young customers are all doing that, then we're going to be stuffed for our future investments. So what they did was they ran a series of sprints to identify what investment products would be appealing for their younger audience, and then actually tailored a whole suite of products just for them so that they would stop leaving the platform. So that was like really cool, right? That's also like amazing. I've also run sprints for zero fasting. Like that was cool. We've done sprints for, just trying to think now. Yeah, I mean, the other thing as well is like if the sprint doesn't work, it's proved the point, right? It doesn't, if you stop it from kind of being wasted, like a wasted effort, like, if you looking at like IBM numbers, like where you're hiring a dev team and you're putting a whole like product team to kind of make something, you could be running up, running costs of millions per year, right? So if you can find out in a few weeks whether that's actually a great idea or not, and you can bin these ideas much faster, that's a much better way to kind of make a more informed decision, right? So, companies should be running, like if they've got really great ideas for new products, there's no reason why they can't run, 5 or 6 a year, but they're typically with different teams and they're never back to back. Otherwise, they just become exhausting. But it's a great way to just really prove if something has the legs to kind of move forward. But then it's also great to kind of go, right, this idea is shit. Like, let's bin it now. Let's move on to the next thing. So, it's as powerful in both ways.
Nice. So to conclude, because we are a little bit out of time, we talked a lot about kind of the big picture stuff. But if there's anyone listening who's feeling inspired and they want like a junior who wanted to lead a sprint, or they want to build the first steps, what would you say they should do? What's the sort of first steps they should take to do that?
10 strangers in a room and make a decision. Throw darts.
You come in.
Yeah. And I guess it varies if you're a startup or if you're, if you're an intern in like a big company, for example. Your biggest challenge will be to kind of have the trust in the team that you can move something forward, because you're obviously playing with people that are very senior. So my advice would be to always get the most senior people in the room that are going to make a decision on whether that thing is going to be made or not. That will be your hardest thing. I would definitely try and kind of participate in a sprint before you just suddenly go and lead your first one. You can definitely read the book. That will help you. And there's loads of different case studies and things like that where you can kind of go and get information. But my hesitation is I know how stressful they are and I know where they can go wrong. So maybe just build up to kind of running your first one. What I will say is that when you do, and this is a bit of advice that I don't give out very often, but when it is your first sprint, I would maybe don't say that it's your first sprint, because the team will lose trust in you or they'll lose confidence in your ability to kind of know whether you're doing this right or not. So I would just say you'll probably find it the most stressful thing in the world. But the other thing is that if no one else has run a sprint, then obviously no one else knows like the process. So if you make a mistake, it's probably not going to be that critical.
Nice.
My other advice would be to, if you've made a mistake and someone's, for example, chosen the wrong how might we or the wrong can we question, and you've realized it's like, oh my God, like this is a grave error. Don't go back on it. Just, it was a decision that was made at the time. You move forward and you somehow still will try and get answers and data for those things. But I would just say that, like, typically, if you are running a sprint, you will have some rough idea of product, and you will be pretty good with people as well. Like, you have to be quite, I would say, quite empathetic with people to try and understand where people are really struggling, and because it is stressful, to try and read the room and to make sure that you're able to kind of do that in a way that you get the best out of everybody. there's another little tool that's up your sleeve as well. So the good thing is thanks to the pandemic, is that a lot of people now do remote sprints. It's actually a great way, if you're running your first sprint, to do a remote sprint first, because you have the pressure removed from you being in the room and everybody looking at you. You can also grab an iPad or a laptop and have notes by the side, so that you can obviously, make sure that you don't miss something. And then obviously, because you've then got the sprint board all mapped out on something like Miro, then you can obviously just follow the board, and then that will also be your kind of guide, which no one really even know that that's happening. So there's a few kind of tactics that you can do to kind of put things in your favor, but it will be a nerve-wracking experience, but you'll come away feeling like, yeah, do you know what, we made some decisions. And if you are able to keep that room and that team glued to what you're doing, then that would be your first objective met. So yeah, it's not impossible. There's just a little bit of prep, I would say, that you have to do beforehand.
That was a good lesson for life.
So how can people connect with you and find out a bit more about Be The Leap?
Yeah, so we have our website, so it's betheleap.com. You can come and find us on our website. You can also find me, Rob Hamblen, on LinkedIn. You can also find me and actually Be The Leap on Instagram as well. And I would say that if this audience is kind of like the audience, I would say probably come find me on Instagram. And if you've got questions, or I always try and do give back. So if you are wanting questions answered, or if you have some trepidation over something, just write me on one of the platforms and I'll try and get back to you.
Thank you so much for your time today, Rob.
No worries. A pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.